I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we analyse Ukraine's surprise attack on the Kursk region in Russia. We discuss Russia's continuing advance across Donbas, and we hear the latest political and diplomatic updates across Europe and the world.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 7th of August, 2 years and 170 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our associate editor Dominic Nicholls, assistant comment editor Francis Dearnley, and transport correspondent Gareth Corfield. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Yeah, hi David, hi team, how are we all getting on? So Russia's focus at the moment is very definitely on the eastern Donetsk region. That's been the pattern of recent months, this slow incremental grinding gains they've been making, but that seems to have sped up in the last couple of weeks and continued yesterday. The big logistic hub of Pokrovsk, so that's about 40 k's northwest of Donetsk city, and Terets, about the same distance due north, a little over halfway to Chasiv Yar and Bakhmut. That area is under particular strain. Just south of Terets, then, the town of New York is looking extremely vulnerable. Russia claims to have taken it. Ukraine say their defences are still holding on, but it's looking like it will fall in the next few days. Just on the village of New York, a Ukrainian official said denied yesterday that Russia had fully captured the village, saying that heavy fighting was continuing. Footage appeared yesterday of what appears to be, however, a soldier raising a Russian flag on top of a building in the town. That footage was on social media. The Kyiv Independent reporting the Ukrainian Deep State Monitoring Service geolocated that building as boarding school number 38, which is in the northwestern part of the village, suggesting most of it has been taken by Russia. The channel presented that image as a signal of what they say is a deteriorating tactical situation on the settlement and its loss in the near future. Now, the main highway in the area, the T0504, we've mentioned it a few times in recent months, that runs northeast from Pokrovsk. That's said to be under Russian fire control. That means that they don't have a physical presence on the highway. They don't own the ground. They don't hold the ground. But they've got eyes on it and can direct fire onto it. So it makes it extremely hazardous for Ukraine to use it to resupply forces in the region. Control of that road and the holding of Pokrovsk and other settlements in the area puts at risk that string of fortified towns running north from that area. So Konstantinivka, Druzhivka, Kramatorsk and Slovyansk. Bakhmut, so just to try to situate you, picture Bakhmut. We've been talking about that for years. So put Bakhmut in the centre of a clock dial. So that string of towns are all between sort of 20 and 30 k's away from roughly the 8 o'clock to the 11 o'clock positions. That's the area we're talking about. Now, despite the intensity of the fighting around Pokrovsk, Sergei Sukhanitsky, who's a press officer for Ukraine's 59th Brigade in the area, spoke to the Financial Times. He said the enemy is simply running out of steam. Now, I think that might be wishful thinking. Russia hasn't deviated much from their tactics in recent years, let's face it. They're pushing at the Jenga block, looking for signs of weakness, looking for areas of weakness they can rush into. And what that means is that even if one strong Ukrainian unit is able to hold the ground they're responsible for, if either side collapses, well, they're not in good order, that unit holding its ground is going to have to withdraw for its own safety. So there is a steady degradation. We've seen that in recent months. It's sped up in the last couple of weeks. Now, this all comes as reports started filtering through yesterday of a Ukrainian incursion into Russia in the Kursk Oblast. That's northeast of Sumy. And possibly, I've seen other reports suggesting there's also a push into next door Belgorod Oblast, north of Kharkiv. More on that in a moment. I point you towards Tatarigami, who's a former Ukrainian army officer, now self-funding military analyst, puts a lot of threads out on Twitter. Ben Wallace, the former defence secretary here in the UK, actually put me on to Tatarigami in the first place. Said he or she, don't know who it is a good analyst. And if it was good enough for the British defence secretary when he was in post, then it's good enough for me. Now, they posted yesterday saying the situation in the Pokrovsk direction is critical, with defences in several areas collapsed and yet to stabilise, largely due to a shortage of personnel. Diverting nearly a brigade, this is what Ukraine thought to have done, diverting nearly a brigade to launch an assault on Kursk Oblast, which lacks strategic sense, borders on mental disability. Francis Farrell, our friend at the Kyiv Independent, he also said on Twitter, if this is true, i.e. a Ukrainian push into Russia, I am really struggling to see how a stunt like this can be justified when the defence of one of the most crucial sectors of the front line is far from under control. And John Foreman, former guest on the pod and also a former UK defence attaché in Moscow and Kyiv, he said Ukraine seems to have a problem with selection and maintenance of the aim and concentration of force. Now, what he's referring to there is British military doctrine. In British doctrine, there are 10 principles of war. They are in no order except for the first, which is selection and maintenance of the aim. Decide what you want to do and just stick to it. Don't keep adjusting your aims. Now, that is the overriding priority, selection and maintenance of the aim. The others, just for reference, maintenance of morale, offensive spirit, surprise, security, flexibility, administration, concentration of force, coordination, and economy of effort. I don't quite know why, but I've always been able to remember that as Amos face. What the hell an Amos face is, I've absolutely no idea. But that's how I can remember the 10 principles of war. And what John is suggesting is that Ukraine has not selected and maintained the aim, and they are suffering for not concentrating their force. So, with all that in mind, what do we think has happened? There seems to be a force of up to brigade strength. So around, depending on the makeup of the units, but you're looking at a couple of thousand people probably. A brigade strength force of Ukrainian military hardware has moved across the border into Russia, into the town of Sudza. That's about 40 km northeast of Sumy, about 5 km inside Russia. There are reports that it is more than a raid by the HUR, Ukraine's military intelligence, and that conventional forces have been used. As I say, it's thought to be a couple of thousand people. Reports also of about 20 armoured vehicles, including US-supplied Stryker infantry fighting vehicles, and around 10 tanks. Now, we have seen a couple of similar incursions in the last 18 months-ish. Both the previous ones put down to the Liberty of Russia Legion, sometimes called the Free Russia Legion, this sort of pro-Ukraine Russian nationals. There have been other groups of Ukraine supporting Russians as well. Now, the last two incursions had very little lasting impact. I think the last one was March this year, actually. We're not sure if the Russia Legion were involved this time, but Meduza, a Russian and English language independent news website headquartered in Riga in Latvia, said that they're citing the Russian pro-war channel Two Majors, a channel normally critical of the Russian Defence Ministry, albeit pro-Russian, as saying that the width of the Kursk region incursion is about 10 kilometres. And then Rybar, another pro-Kremlin Telegram channel, said a total of about 400 Ukrainian armed forces had entered the region, with up to 2,000 concentrated along the border. ABC News are reporting Alexei Smirnov, who's Kursk's acting governor, said he on Telegram said that blood banks are stocking up, calling for the public to go give blood because of the fighting. They're quoting Mr. Smirnov as saying all emergency services were on high alert, and in the last 24 hours, our region has been heroically resisting attacks. Russia's defence ministry today said that military and border guard troops, quote, continue to destroy Ukrainian military units in the areas alongside the border in the Kursk region, unquote. The ministry said that Russian forces backed by artillery and jets and other bits and bobs didn't allow the enemy to advance deeper into the territory of the Russian Federation, adding the operation to destroy Ukrainian military units is continuing. Okay, so that's what we think has happened or is happening. There is a lot of debate about the effectiveness of this operation. What is it designed to do? Has it got the resources to achieve that? To echo John Foreman's point, whether it's a good use of the very limited resources Kyiv has. People are questioning whether or not it's drawing valuable Ukrainian forces away from the Donbas, where there's, as I say, a real push from Russia at the moment. Is it drawing Russian forces away from that area to counter this incursion? Now, we've said many times before, offensive operations are usually more costly than defensive operations. So is this too big a risk for Ukraine? Russia has a huge number of conscripts in the area. Now, Russia always plays fast and loose about the status of individuals and soldiers, but conscripts, as opposed to contracted soldiers, are not expected to be deployed outside Russia. So they are there in the region, not brilliantly trained, equipped or led, but they are there in numbers. So is it a good idea, basically? Is it just to change the narrative? Is it a morale boost? There's no denying the power of that, but at what cost is it coming? Is it to try to stop some of the drone launches and get to some of the air bases that are firing glide bombs and what have you into Ukraine? Well, possibly, but that's a hell of a tough mission, and probably not one supported by the Western donated weapons, which you'll remember were only given to be used inside Russia in support of efforts to repel the Kharkiv incursion, that lodgement of Russian forces just north of Kharkiv. Now, it might be to try and degrade Russia's ground line of communications, the road and rail links, keeping their forces, the task group north, in northeast Ukraine. So that might be a good mission, but is it good enough to justify taking the forces away from elsewhere? And would that, the aim of this mission is to try and cut off the ground lines of communication for Russia's task group north, is that good enough to allow the US to say, yes, you can use our weapons inside Russia? We don't know. We're not trying to give you an answer. We're just throwing up all the points of debate. Is the juice worth the squeeze, basically? Is it all worth the effort? That debate will rumble on. Now then, you will see as part of this, you'll find it on social media, I think we've got it on our website, that as part of this activity, it looks like there are claims that a Ukrainian drone, a first-person view drone, has taken down a helicopter. Be very careful here, folks. There's footage on social media that appears to show a Russian Mi-28 Havoc attack helicopter hit by a drone, reportedly over Kursk. The drone, obviously first-person view, so we see it from the drone's point of view. We think it hits the tail rotor of the aircraft. Now that is, there's no denying it, an absolutely critical part of the aircraft and the whole sort of staying in the air game. Newton's third law of motion: for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. So that's what the tail rotor does. It stops the whole airframe spinning in the opposite direction to the main rotor and at the same speed. It will eventually, the airframe will do that, will speed up or try to speed up. It will break apart before it gets as fast as any main rotor. That's what the tail rotor does. So it's absolutely critical. But unless there's any explosion that wipes out the Mi-28, the crew should be trained to perform an emergency landings without the tail rotor. You basically turn the power off. So there's no drive to the tail rotor. It's like putting the clutch in a car or disengaging the main drive to a car. You're still going forwards, or in the case of a helicopter, you're still going down. But as long as the airframe integrity is intact, it should be survivable. Helicopter pilots are trained. I remember I was trained to survive an engine off or complete disaster if you need to turn the engine off. What you have to do is you demand all the lift that's left in the blades at the last possible moment when you're nearly hitting the ground. We were always taught to draw all the power in when you're at the height you would be if you're sat on a horse, which obviously is bloody helpful if you've never ridden a horse before. But at the last minute, you draw all the power in and try to effectively hover for a moment, a few feet above the ground, and then the airframe gently rests on the ground. That's what should happen. So the aircraft may be operational if all it's lost is its tail rotor. But we just don't know. Engine off landings, I have to say, particularly in a single engine helicopter, is the sport of kings. Now, elsewhere, just a couple more updates, David. The Kyiv Independent reporting today a total of 13 Ukrainian oblasts came under Russian attack yesterday. There were casualties, including deaths in Dnipropetrovsk, Kharkiv, Kherson, Zaporizhia and Donetsk oblasts. Air Force said Russia launched 30 Shahed-type drones from the Russian town of Yeysk. That's on Russia's Sea of Azov coast, right up in the northeast corner of the Sea of Azov. And also drones fired from the city of Primorsko-Akhtarsk. That's also on the coast of the Sea of Azov, but a little bit further south. Now, all the drones fired at Kyiv, Kherson, Mykolaiv, Vinnytsia, Cherkasy, Kharkiv and Khmelnytskyi oblasts were shot down, Ukraine says. And Kyiv Independent are also reporting Ukrainian special forces destroyed Russian equipment, personnel and fortifications during a raid of the Tendra Spit off the coast of Kherson Oblast, the bit that sort of sticks into the Black Sea. This came from Ukraine's military intelligence service speaking earlier today, reported, as I say, by the Kyiv Independent. Now, the Tendra Spit is a very narrow sort of chain of sandy islands and stuff in the northern Black Sea, about 50 k's southwest of Kherson, and sort of the same distance southeast of Odessa, a little bit south if you drew that line, a little bit further south. But the HUR, so Ukraine's military intelligence agency, said on Telegram on August the 6th, Special Operations Forces of the Artan Unit and the Maritime Centre of Ukraine's HUR carried out an operation in the northern part of the Black Sea. Now, they say this amphibious support group or special forces group landed overnight, destroyed a number of armoured vehicles, which they cite were MTLB, amphibious personnel carriers. That was the MTLB. We took a video of it. There's one in Kyiv. We did a little video on all the destroyed equipment there some time ago. You'll be able to find that online. Mini turret long body was how we were taught to remember that, or Mrs. Thatcher's little bruiser. I never understood why MTLB was called Mrs. Thatcher's little bruiser. They also say they destroyed electronic warfare systems and a number of ground fortifications. They say Russian troops suffered losses, although I put no number on that, and said that they suffered no losses in the action. We have no way of verifying any of that. But it just shows that I think they're trying to spread their activity. Quite whether or not it is enough to draw, if this is what the aim is, draw Russian forces away from the eastern Donbas. It's unclear, but we'll obviously continue to monitor it. And that's us up to date today, David.
Well, thank you very much, Dom. It's very good to have you back. Francis Dearnley, can I turn to you now? What have you been looking at in the diplomatic and political spheres?
Thanks, David, and it's good to have Dom back in the studio. The pizza-loving hounds of London will be rejoicing, no doubt. Let's start in the Middle East, though, where tensions remain high as Iran still measures up its response against Israel for the recent assassination in Tehran of the leader of Hamas. Putin has been very vocal in the past 24 hours, urging Iran to show restraint and not target civilians in any planned attack. Yes, you heard that. The brass neck is just extraordinary. But such a statement is designed to fulfill several purposes, which I'll come to in a moment. That message to Ayatollah Khomeini, Iran's supreme leader, was delivered through Sergei Shoigu, the Secretary of Russia's Security Council, in meetings with Iranian officials who apparently asked Russia to bolster its air defences in apparent preparations for a tit-for-tat conflict with Israel. That's coming from the New York Times. Russian air defence equipment and advanced radars have apparently started to arrive in Iran, its sources claim. Now, to understand this apparent contradiction, delivering material with one hand while seeking to de-escalate with the other, it's important to contextualise this. Iran is, as we all know, a key ally for Russia, most significantly by providing Moscow with Shahed drones. It will feel it is owed support in any confrontation, hence the weapons. But then why, at the same time, urge Iran to be cautious? Think of it this way. Putin still has a standing relationship with Israel due to Moscow's role as a broker in the Middle East and in order to coordinate operations over Syria. So this is likely an attempt to support an ally, but not to upset Israel too overtly, and to try and emphasise that the weapons it's giving Tehran are purely defensive. But more importantly, this is, I think, Putin trying to portray himself as a statesman in the region, seeking to lower tensions whilst portraying the United States as the fundamental aggressor. It may also be signalling to Western powers that it can be worked with, laying the groundwork for the possibility of Ukraine negotiations. Now, we'll continue to monitor the Middle East situation closely as things are very volatile. I've seen numerous headlines over the last few days where people are saying, expect war to erupt at any moment. I don't think we should go that far, but nonetheless, it remains a powder keg, and our sister podcast, Battle Lines, has looked more deeply into the assassination and its ramifications. So if you're interested in that, we will add a link in the show notes. Now, turning to the United States specifically, Vice President Harris has picked Tom Waltz as her Democratic running mate. Now, I won't go over all of the details into his background. He's quite a characterful individual, but What's been less covered elsewhere, I think, is his Ukraine and foreign policy stance. So let's specifically look at that. He's governor of Minnesota, former congressman, and is an army veteran. He served in the US National Guard, where he spent portions of his 24 years of service in deployment across the US and Europe. He was also a high school social studies and geography teacher, interestingly, with teaching stints in China. So he knows the country better than most. He's well-travelled and plugged into contemporary military debates. Now, on the war specifically, Waltz has consistently backed Kyiv against Russian aggression from the very first day of the conflict. On the day it all broke out, he declared that Minnesota stood with the people of Ukraine and condemned Russia for its illegal aggression. That's almost a direct quote from him. Later, he took concrete steps by signing an executive order mandating all state agencies to sever ties with Russian and Belarusian entities. He maintained active support for Kyiv through diplomatic channels. He made a visit to the Ukrainian embassy in Washington and is said to have participated in high-level discussions with Zelensky alongside other US governors, as well as spearheading a formal partnership between Minnesota and Chernihiv Oblast this year. I think that was back in February. As Euromaidan Press highlight, Minnesota is a key place, not just because of him, but also because of its role in building Ukraine's defence capabilities. The state produces critical drones and ammunition, with BAE Systems also manufacturing essential howitzer parts. And as we keep saying, of course, that when there are critiques made from some entities in the United States talking about this idea of money going abroad to Kyiv, the fact that a lot of that money for Kyiv is spent in the United States and actually benefits particular states due to weapons procurement and expansion. So it bears repeating that point. I know we've said it many times, but it is an important one, and Minnesota is one of those states. So there is increasing evidence, and I don't think it's too far to say this, following the advisors that Harris appointed last week. Her ticket is informed and sympathetic on the subject of Ukraine, at least more so than Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, at least in the sympathy states. Yesterday, Harris described her and Waltz as the underdogs, though recent polling has suggested some movement in their direction in battleground states. And of course, it's those battleground states that remain most critical. But there is still a long way to go. And in the meantime, Russia is doing everything it can to put itself in the most favourable negotiating position come November. Hence why, of course, we're seeing such concerted operational efforts in Ukraine at the moment, as well as those diplomatic endeavours that we've described in recent days. But let's finish in Europe, where I'm sorry to say, David, especially given that you're a fluent French speaker, I think it's finally time to hang up my beret and onions and say adieu to my nickname of Francophile Francis. Ever since the election... That's enough, Dom. You've only been back a day. Ever since the election in France, Macron has gone very quiet on Ukraine, constrained, of course, by his own domestic challenges. And today, we learn that shipments of Russian liquefied natural gas to France more than doubled in the first half of this year, according to new analysis of trade data, at a time when Europe has tried to pull back from energy purchases to help finance the invasion of Ukraine. As listeners know, just a bit more context here, Europe has restricted oil imports from Russia, but natural gas is still allowed. And while companies in France are importing the most, one analysis found EU countries overall imported 7% more Russian LNG in the first half of this year compared to the same period a year ago. The next biggest importers, Spain and Belgium, saw a 1% rise and a 16% decline, respectively. Total Energies, the French energy giant that accounted for the largest share of the imports, is bound by contracts, we understand, signed before Russia's invasion. But France's Finance and Economy Ministry told AP that Houthi rebel attacks on ships moving through the Suez Canal had been the main response for this and forced a reshaping of LNG imports. Gas from the Middle East can no longer as easily get to Europe, while Russia's route from the Arctic has been unaffected. That, of course, was something that was speculated at the time would have ramifications on this very subject, and so it has proved. Now we're seeing the data. At the same time, France was importing more Russian LNG. It was importing less, though, from other suppliers, including the United States, Angola, Cameroon, Egypt and Nigeria, an amount approaching the jump in Russian LNG, according to analysis. None of those other countries' exports were affected by the Red Sea attacks, hence why some people are feeling that France is going and doing more that's damaging than perhaps it needs to. Now, crucially, this extra gas isn't being used by French homes or industry. Demand in France has actually fallen 9% in the first half of this year compared to last. Meanwhile, France's export of gas by its pipeline to Belgium rose almost 10% in the first 6 months of this year. It would seem that this is export, this is profit. So gas specifically is coming in from Russia and then being sold for profit, going through France to other countries in Europe. People are making money off the trade in France. Now, the EU has been very quick to say that more generally imports of Russian gas have fallen considerably between 21 and 23. A temporary volume increase does put into question the EU achievements over the past 2 years, a spokesman has said, but we have diversified our imports and the bulk of the necessary gas is supplied by reliable partners, such as the Norwegians, and the US. Nonetheless, all of that said, by my own rule of looking at deeds, not words, Paris has, I think, fallen short of the strong rhetoric Macron was putting out several months ago. Now, France, I would love to be able to say nice things about you, but you keep letting us down. There'll be, I think, a lot of conversations that will need to be happening in France about the Ukraine stance in the coming months, particularly, of course, given we don't really know what the full extent of the fallout was following the election. Things have basically been paused because of the Olympic Games. But nonetheless, France has to decide its direction of travel on this, because there is increasing evidence that it has weakened in its support for Kyiv, particularly when it comes to money. Macron may be in a situation where he can talk more strongly about foreign affairs because he will be impeded at home. But more likely, his focus will be on the domestic agenda and trying to change the domestic political map so that he is not effectively neutered from power by the insurgent far left and indeed far right. So I don't think we can hold our breath. But as I say, David, I'm very sorry to say that I think Francophile Francis is no more. Croissant embargoes at Telegraph Towers.
Well, thank you very much, Dom and Francis, for your time and your reporting there. Gareth Corfield, our transport correspondent, thank you for waiting so patiently for us to get to you. You've been looking at in the last few weeks some of the efforts and the news and the updates around the story of volunteers, specifically British volunteers, taking supplies and vehicles to Ukraine. What have you found, Gareth?
David, yes, thank you. It's always a pleasure, never a chore to be back on the pod. I'm sorry to hear of the demise of Francophile Francis, but perhaps that's not a bad thing in the grand scheme of things. Yes, to the topic then, the volunteer efforts to donate cars to Ukraine. There's just to sort of fill in the background here, there's a large volunteer movement across the UK dedicated to buying up old or surplus cars and vans and light vehicles and so on, and driving them into Ukraine for humanitarian use or for use as battlefield ambulances and rescue vehicles and so on and so forth. Earlier this year, the Mayor of London was eventually pressurised by central government into officially setting up a scheme whereby cars destined for scrap under the ULEZ scheme can in fact be preserved from scrap and sent to Ukraine instead, thereby meeting two objectives with one general policy thrust, you might put it. The volunteer efforts then have been integrated with that semi-official scheme, with that officially endorsed scheme since March. It's administered on Transport for London's behalf by a charity called British Ukrainian Aid. Somewhere around 300 plus vehicles, I think so far, have been donated. We expect the scheme is going to draw to a close by the end of this month, that is the end of August. However, the volunteer efforts from everybody I've spoken to will continue, as indeed they were prior to the official scheme going. It's one of those sort of little known or items that you don't really get so much of in the public consciousness. The scheme itself, the officially endorsed scheme took a bit of jiggery pokery, I think is the best way to put it, from the British government. It was originally proposed by Vitaly Klitschko, who wrote to the London Mayor Sadiq Khan last September, saying, you have this scheme going on where drivers in London can hand in cars that don't comply with the ULEZ emission scheme's rules, can hand them in for scrap in return for a grant. Instead of scrapping them, why don't you send them over to us so we can make use of them? Because these are perfectly serviceable vehicles. They just don't meet exhaust rules on particulates, emissions, harmful gases and so on. And Sadiq Khan was, I think, reluctant to do so. He immediately dismissed the scheme or dismissed the idea. It took the personal intervention of the Transport Secretary, Mark Harper, who publicly wrote to Mr Khan earlier this year and said there are no barriers to this. Khan had tried to claim there was a legal barrier, and said there is no legal barrier. There's nothing stopping you doing this. You are at full liberty to go ahead and do it. So eventually the official scheme was set up in March. Now, there was a bit of controversy around the setting up of the official scheme because the volunteer networks that I've mentioned, which are fairly loose and informal, but also quite well established in their own way, in their own sort of community, if you will, had been quite successfully conveying, so I'm told, hundreds of cars to Ukraine since the outbreak of the current Russian invasion from September 2022 onwards. There was a bit of friction there as the official scheme was set up. British Ukrainian aid came in for a bit of flack, not unfairly, I think, for being a bit slow to get out of the blocks. And there was a bit of controversy, which Telegraph readers will recall, about a field in Dorking, Surrey. BUA, the charity, was gathering all these vehicles it was receiving from Transport for London's scrappage scheme to a field in Ukraine where volunteer drivers would then be assigned a car or a van and told, here you go, take this one over to Ukraine. The field was filling up, but due to bureaucratic hold-ups, drivers weren't being told, yep, collect these and carry on. And there was a bit of official smoke and mirrors to try and make out it wasn't happening, although it was the case, and we had a photographer over there to show the state of the field. Now, since then, everything has moved along and everything's going smoothly until last week, actually, when I spoke to the owner of the field, William Lewis. Mr. Lewis is 80 years old. He's donated his field for the use of British Ukrainian aid. And it turns out that his local council, which by the way is not inside London, it's in Surrey, his local council has objected to the use of his field to to store these cars destined for Ukraine. And they've actually threatened him with a £1,000 fine unless he stops using the field for storing the vehicles being donated to Ukraine by the end of the month. So it's all got a little bit weird. The local council alleges that Mr. Lewis's use of his field to store the vehicles is in breach of planning permission laws. For our non-British readers, we have a very complicated system in this country where you have to apply for permission from the local authorities to do pretty much anything you want to do with any land or property or buildings that you own. And apparently this also stretches to parking cars on a field that is otherwise in no use at all. Anyway, Mr. Lewis, I think it is fair to say, was not a great fan of the local council's approach to this and has vowed to continue using the field until the end of the month, which happens to be when the official ULEZ scheme is expected to run out of funding and draw to a graceful close anyway. So it seems that there's a bit of fudge factor in here now. Transport for London, to be fair to them, has actually come out and hailed Mr. Lewis's, quote, incredible contribution towards the scrappage scheme. So there's a positive note there. But the scheme itself, it ought to be higher profile, I think. Valery Zaluzhny, the former chief of the general staff in Ukraine, as of course is now the Ukrainian ambassador to London, made several references to it in his very first public appearance in London, which was again at the end of July. Standing on the steps of the Ukrainian embassy, he made a speech praising those involved in the scheme, the professional administrators at TfL, British Ukrainian Aid, and the volunteers involved in organising and carrying out the deliveries of these surplus vehicles. So, yes, it's all very it's all very up in the air at the moment. I think the scheme is going to continue certainly to the end of the month. The official funding at that point, I think, dries up. But the volunteers have all told me that they will continue sending these badly needed cars and vans to Ukraine. So that's the situation. It's a good thing. It's a very positive thing. It's a tangible piece of popular British support for Ukraine and demonstrates that, 2 years into this, there's still a great deal of public affection for Ukraine and a desire to help in any way that people can.
Thank you very much, Gareth, for joining us today. And we'll come back to your final thought, of course. I'd be particularly interested in your thinking around the morale of the people who are taking their vehicles and donating their vehicles to Ukraine. And also, of course, how that's changed over the past few months, few years, the kind of vehicles, that sort of thing. Coming up, we hear Dom, Francis and Gareth's final thoughts. Let's first go to Dom, I think. Dom, you've had 2 weeks off on a well-deserved holiday. Welcome back. It's very good to have you back. What are your first final thoughts rejoining us?
Thanks, David. So I'm going to return to this Kursk incursion, whatever it is, this thing that Ukraine seems to be doing inside Russia now. And I just urge folk not to rush to conclusions. I'm certainly not going to do that. We just don't know what the aims of this operation are, and therefore be in any position to judge the success or failure of this action as and when that happens, and therefore be able to draw any conclusions as to whether it's unhelpfully drawn Ukrainian focus and maybe forces away from the Donbas. But I just note that Ukraine was very heavily criticised earlier this year for its failure of the counteroffensive, failure to break through Russian defensive lines. Remember all the minefields and all that kind of stuff in the counteroffensive. The hardest, as a segue byline, the hardest thing you could ask a conventional force to do, breach a minefield opposed by the enemy in full view, etc., etc. So it was a very difficult task. But anyway, they were very heavily criticised for failing to do that when they were trying to manoeuvre on the battlefield, trying to move, not just do a static line and incremental advances Russia have done. They're trying to use the ground more intelligently. Here they are breaching Russian defences. They've got through whatever Russia had at the border. I don't know if they had a line of minefields or trenches or God knows what they had, but, well, Ukraine got through it. Now, this is much more mobile offensive activity from Ukraine that we've seen in a very long time, probably since the Kharkiv charge in late 2022. This also seems to be more than a kind of Russia Legion plus push. So we don't know what it is, but it is trying to introduce an element of manoeuvre to the battlefield. It is trying to use the weapons that have been gifted to them. So let's keep a close eye on it, but also keep our powder dry and resist the temptation to lurch from saying, oh, they need to do more manoeuvre on the battlefield, to saying, why they need to stop manoeuvring and just send everyone to the front lines and the trenches. The two thoughts just don't sit comfortably together. Ukraine have decided that this is worth an effort, so let's see where it goes before we judge the effectiveness and whether or not, as I say, it's drawn too much focus away from what's happening in the Donbas.
Thank you very much, Dom, there. And of course, if you are in Russia, do let us know how this is being reported in Russian media and what ordinary people are saying about it. Francis Dearnley, can I come to you next?
Thanks, David. Hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. How often do you hear that on social media? Musk has been tweeting it, and it's one of those perennial quotations that always seems to go viral at some point or another. In terms of its source, it's from a post-apocalyptic novel by the author G. Michael Hopf, and it sums up, as I say, this very pervasive cyclical view of history. Often it's used to support the idea that strong peoples can be forged from hardship. And I've seen it used numerous times to describe why Russia can never be defeated, because you've got this army of people who've been hardened by generations, maybe even centuries of sufferance. And indeed, it's become so ubiquitous that it's actually got a term that's sometimes used, the Fremen mirage, after the science fiction novel Dune and its desert dwellers, whose harsh conditions make for morally pure and military strong people, whilst wealth and sophistication make for decadent societies and poor fighters. I just want to make the very simple point that this has been a debate for centuries and has been very much contested and even dismissed. So when you see it go viral, it's not some new revelation. It's something that has been questioned even since ancient history. So the Spartans, of course, were following that idea of a people who made themselves better fighters, supposedly by putting themselves through hardship, and yet they were decisively militarily defeated at Leuctra and never recovered. And indeed, there are so many examples from history of peoples who, despite poverty, despite hardship due to the weather, despite economic conditions, whatever, were decisively defeated and never came back. They were not enabled. They were not stronger because of their weaknesses. They were actually impeded hugely by it. So I just wanted to make that very simple point, which won't be a shock to many of our very informed listeners. But when you see that post, it makes people get very angry and start criticising democratically elected leaders and start pointing at people like Putin and saying, look, this is absolutely true. This is where we're heading up. But even figures like Edward Gibbon, who wrote The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, questioned this analysis of history. It's far more complicated. So a simple point, but when you see it, don't believe it, because the fact is it's been around for a very long time. And as ever with history, it's always more complicated than it appears.
Thank you very much, Dom and Francis. Gareth, quickly, can I have your final thoughts, please?
Thank you, David. Yes. In terms of the volunteers, you mentioned morale. I think morale is broadly good. It's always good to have official backing and recognition. And even when that runs out at the end of the month or some first week of September, I think people will continue conveying their old cars to Ukraine on unwanted vans, vehicles, taxis and so on. As an indicator of morale and generally how people are thinking about it, I was told at the embassy a couple of weeks ago when Ambassador Zaluzhny was giving his speech that there are moves afoot by some to put together a screenplay with a view to pitching it to Netflix to showcase the efforts of the volunteers. Now that may have just been a bit of loose talk. So the refreshments afterwards are very good. I did quite enjoy the Ukrainian beers we had. So that will probably give you a flavour of how serious that suggestion was. However, the fact that people are talking about trying to get TV series made out of their exploits suggests that this is going to continue and that broadly the section of the British public involved in vehicle donations to Ukraine is happy, positive, upbeat and wants it to continue. Indeed, I've received more than one invitation while I was there to join vehicle convoys. That's more than one vehicle at a time going out to Ukraine over the next few weeks and months. Yes, at risk of trying to end on a high note, I think things are going well and looking up on that front.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our world affairs newsletter which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Giles Gear, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.